If everyone can just take their seats, we might get started because we are about 15 minutes behind schedule. So I am going to ask the speakers to stick strictly to their 20 minutes of talking. I will just mention that Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which I'm here representing, is a very proud supporter of the Indonesia project and of the Indonesia update, which plays a really important role in the broader policy debate on Indonesia, so thank you to the team there. Our first speaker today is Jamie Davidson. Jamie is with the National University of Singapore as an associate professor of political science there. His latest book is Indonesia's Changing Political Economy, Governing the Roads. His current project examines the politics of rice policy in Southeast Asia, and today he's talking on eminent domain and infrastructure under Yudhoyono and Jokowi's administrations. Thanks, Jamie.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon. So I'll kind of get right to it. The core argument of my paper is the following. On the one hand, Jokowi appears committed to make his campaign pledge of improving Indonesia's crumbling physical infrastructure a reality. Most notably, his decision to slash billions from the government's fuel subsidies bill and spend the near entirety of these savings on investment in infrastructure. On the other hand, he has yet to make a similar breakthrough in another key aspect of infrastructure provision, that is, in land governance, and in particular, the involuntary appropriation of land in the name of the public interest. It is unlikely Jokowi will make any breakthrough anytime soon in this field because, one, he lacks the requisite parliamentary support, and two, I know he was just elected, but for infrastructure takes some time, and he does face time pressure conditioned by the imperative of re-election. Thus, Jokowi's infrastructure plans in all likelihood will be constrained by the specific policy legacy in the state's power of eminent domain bequeathed to him by SBY's administration. So let's examine that legacy. Some of this is drawn from previous research of mine, a book that was just published. So SBY's first administration was really the first post-Suharto presidency to face the following dilemma. How would a democratic yet weakened central government go about assembling the public right-of-way necessary for building the many infrastructure projects in a fair and equitable manner? In response to investor concerns over Indonesia's land problem, so to speak, in 2005, SBY promulgated perhaps the most contentious decree of its first term, number 36 of 2005. On land acquisition for the implementation of development in the public interest. Here, SBY, or Yudhoyono, relied on precedent, namely Suharto's presidential decision of number 55 on the same topic, and in fact, even of the same name. The controversy behind SBY's decree stemmed from the fact that Indonesia's first directly elected president issued a decree that on paper appeared more draconian than Suharto's. One reason for the decree's severity was that his administration could no longer rely on the army or security apparatus to clear the land if local resistance proved stiff. For instance, the 1993 version listed just two ways for landowners to release their rights over their land to the government in the public interest, either by relinquishing or transferring them. And Yudhoyono's added a third, nullifying such rights at the president's discretion. Yudhoyono's 2005 regulation also detailed a procedure that involved the courts, much more than the 1993 decree of Suharto's. If negotiations were not resolved within the specified time limit, the government committees could deposit their offer or their money at a district court, and thereby legally complete the transaction with little recourse for challenges or appeals. In short, it was as if SBY's government was trying to replace the coercion of the army with the equally undemocratic threat of legal action to get its way. Due to public anger over his decree, SBY issued a brief presidential decree, number 65 of 2006, amending his 2005 version. An attempt at compromise, it slashed the number of types of public interest projects to 7. All references to the nullification of land rights at the president's discretion was expunged. Unaltered, however, was the composition of the local land acquisition committees. They remained staffed by local government officials, compromising any independence or neutrality as assessors or mediators in disputes. Unlike under Suharto, Yudhoyono's decrees failed to become the blunt instrument of state power to appropriate land in the public interest, as some in his administration, like Vice President Kala, first time being vice president, and investors hoped they would become. For starters, Yudhoyono refused to resort to the presidential power of expropriation, pencabutan, of people's land rights that law number 21 of 1961 still permitted and was still legally on the books at the time. Yudhoyono, as a democratically elected president, loathed to be seen as revoking such rights with the stroke of a pen. Another obstacle was decentralization. An egregious mismatch of incentive structures between the central and local officials emerged. Now, central officials remained in charge of the national infrastructure projects like tollways, and thus had incentives to have land deals concluded as fast as possible. Incentives could be of the public kind, including a belief in the benefits that expressways bring, like lower transportation costs, lower manufacturing costs, more jobs, higher economic growth, and so on. Incentives could also be private, like prestige for Yudhoyono and his desire to leave a legacy. High-ranking bureaucrats in public works can receive handsome bonuses for project completion, and upon retirement, they also might avail themselves to consultancy positions with private firms. There's also illicit gain to be had amidst the auction of project licenses. Yet such central government projects are located in jurisdictions that are largely controlled by local officials, whose incentive structures differ appreciably. There is less prestige and no performance bonuses for completing these projects. Underpaid and overworked, local officials were tasked with the thankless job of dealing with angry citizens being forced to move. So where did the local officials obtain their rent? Although difficult to document, apparently the answer was in the purchasing of land parcels, mostly through proxies, that would be required for such projects as the Trans-Java Expressway. The years-long delays gave local bureaucrats and politicians the ample opportunity to acquire foreknowledge of the route's details. But a delay of a few months or a year would not affect their strategies markedly. They were determined to get their cut. Local officials generally considered the meandering pace of land taking the central government's problem, not theirs. National officials are, after all, statutorily and financially in charge of these projects. Their condescending attitude and actions toward their local counterparts only made things worse. So buoyed by his re-election in 2009, Yudhoyono used his political capital to embark on a statutory-based reform strategy to the problem of sluggish land acquisition in Indonesia, thus breaking with decades of governance tradition on the matter. The original target date for the passing of the new law was missed by 2 years, for among other things, the complications caused by two competing forms of governance reform being championed in Indonesia. One, having a one-stop business licensing center to facilitate investment, but also enacting decentralization. In the end, the new law, the 2012, Law 2, 2012, was a product of compromise between the Special Intercommission Parliamentary Committee, Pansus, and the government. In short, the former tried to bolster the rights and protections of citizens, while the latter sought to bolster its discretionary powers. For example, regarding the crucial list of categories of projects eligible for eminent domain status, the Pansus succeeded in removing the power of presidential prerogative. Now, a key change concerns institutional supervision. The central government was put in charge of land acquisition once again, although BPN was not named specifically in the bill. This allowed for the possibility of establishing a new government body specifically for land acquisition issues perhaps in the future. In all, the new land law represented a re-centralization of national government powers in contradistinction to the country's famed regional autonomy. Now, the first controversy to arise concerned one of the Act's final provisions. According to the government's draft bill, the land purchases already underway, so the process already underway, those prior regulations could be applied. Now, of course, this implied that they did not have to be, affording the government flexibility in each case. Now, the Pansus argued that this was unfair and that it would create uncertainty and lead to arbitrary government decision-making. So the word can, or dapat, was eliminated from the clause in the final law. Now prior laws and regulations had to be applied. Investors appreciated the law's many pro-investor provisions, welcoming such measures as the inclusion of immaterial values to improve the compensation process. They were willing to trade a rise in land costs for the certainty of acquisition. They found this last clause, however, about the applicability of old or new rules troubling and confounding, however. Several months after the law's promulgation in August 2012, Yudhoyono finally signed the much-anticipated presidential regulation confirming BPN's role as an executor of involuntary land acquisition in the public interest. This regulation also stipulated that Yudhoyono's 2005 and 2006 eminent domain decrees would apply to outstanding procurement cases. Yet the regulation failed to clarify other important matters, including the percentage at which land acquisition on a specific turnpike for consignment purposes would be considered complete, and provisions for sanctions of noncompliance. Subsequently, a flurry of presidential decrees on eminent domain has been published. Even business interests have expressed exasperation over the rapid succession of such decrees, two by Yudhoyono and one by Jokowi, and consequent technical changes to the law that are causing uncertainty and reflecting poorly on government resolving commitment. So SBA's third edict on the matter, number 99 of 2014, changes were sought to ameliorate investor concerns over the confusion about which set of eminent domain regulations can be applied that was noted above. So accordingly, it was stipulated that if land acquisition for a specific turnpike or project had reached 75% by the end of this year, December 31st, 2015, then SBY's 2005 and 2006 decrees should apply. Otherwise, those regulated by the 2012 eminent domain law and SBA's two subsequent edicts will take effect. All right? Confused? You can imagine what local officials feel on the ground. Now, Jokowi's decree number 30 of 2015 contained two meaningful changes. First, it allows for private firms to pay compensation with their own money upon which they will be reimbursed by the relevant state agency. Second, Jokowi's decree allows gubernatorial location permits for the projects to be extended for another 2 years. Now, this was done in recognition of the delays that have beset most projects. Now, the issuance of gubernatorial location permits play a key role in Indonesian land governance, and in part explains some of the process's sluggishness. For example, when the governor issues the permit, it is often accompanied by a freeze on the selling of affected property in order to end speculation. Yet this often means that the government freezes its levels of compensation at maybe at market rates, but at the time of the issuance of the governor's permit. But because the sourcing of monies to actually pay the landowners can take years, landowners are often offered compensation at market rates that are several years out of date. In the meantime, land prices in Indonesia and especially on Java continue to skyrocket. Now, so far, Jokowi's administration, like Yudhoyono's, has shown little willingness to set compensation at fair market rates. It should consider doing this, however, if it desires increased efficiency. The trade-off between higher short-term project costs in return for longer-term efficiency gains in the form of faster project completion should be taken seriously. It might offer one of the few ways to realize Jokowi's grand infrastructure ambitions. Now, two final points before I conclude. The first are some continuities, some more troubling than others, in land acquisition between Yudhoyono's and Jokowi's administrations. One is the MP3 EI, the master plan. It's up there on the slide. Of course, this is Yudhoyono's plan. Now, Jokowi, of course, he's going to be seen as a man of action, and completing these projects really didn't have time to design his own. So this is a continuation from Yudhoyono's administrations. But there are others. They include blanket statements by ministers that problems in acquiring land is the primary obstacle in preventing the government from upgrading Indonesia's infrastructure. The exploitation of the judiciary is a threat to force landowners into accepting low compensation rates. The halting of the acquisition process on the ground for months, if not longer, because of local government uncertainty over the application of the relevant regulations, and a continued trusted, although highly misplaced, belief in the publication of highly technical ministerial decrees as some sort of solution. Second are the reforms that Jokowi's government have not embarked upon, specifically at BPN. BPN is perceived as a notoriously corrupt and incapable of handling the great volume of eminent domain cases. It is among the least trusted state agencies in the eyes of Indonesians. But SBY's land law bequeathed this specific institutional legacy to Jokowi by re-centralizing the state's powers of eminent domain and placing them squarely in BPN's hands. Now, if Jokowi endeavors to demonstrate tangible progress on his infrastructure agenda, he has neither the time nor possess the adequate parliamentary support to amend this problem statutorily. So in conclusion, a survey of involuntary land acquisition between Yudhoyono's and Jokowi's administrations is a graphic illustration of Sholto Nohold's pithy phrase of changing continuities that he used to describe the dynamics of transition from the new order to the post-Suharto era. On the changing side of the ledger, Jokowi has mobilized massive amounts of state resources to be invested in infrastructure provision. Now, on the side of continuities, many would assert that it takes more than money to accelerate infrastructure provision without the proper institutional frameworks in place. Jokowi does not possess the necessary time or political clout to enact widespread institutional reforms necessary for involuntary land acquisition, the other key part in infrastructure provision. Now, unless his government is more willing to pass these new financial windfalls onto the people whose land happens to stand in the way of these projects, Jokowi's record on infrastructure might start to resemble that of his predecessor. Now, SBY won re-election regardless. It remains to be seen if Jokowi is capable of replicating the feat. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks for sticking to time. Our next speaker is Delik Hudalah. He's come here from Bandung Institute of Technology, where he is an associate professor of urban and regional planning. His research interests are on the interface between urban and rural changes, between socioeconomic development and environmental protection, and between global forces and local politics in the production of edge urban spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. In this occasion, I will present the result of one of my research during 2011, which is on analyzing the effectiveness and performance of Indonesian land policy system, in order to improve the access of low-income people to houses, especially around the city areas. And major arguments of this case studies that I will present it is that the maintenance of the centralized land administration system has contributed to the complexity of improving or speeding up the access of urban poor to land development for housing. There will be 4 themes in this presentation. Before I come to the case studies, I will point out several strategic issues, but some will be skipped because I think it has been mentioned by the keynote speakers. So first is the context that Indonesia urbanization is now in the new phase because more than half of the people now reside within the urban areas or extended urban areas, and it's predicted to be growing and growing. And that means there will be more housing demands. Even in the past decades, there were about more than 1 million new housing demands per year. Considering the limitation of the governments, there are always housing backlog, that number of millions of housing units were not realized, or people have don't access to good houses. And even millions of people were considered homeless or living in uninhabitable dwellings. And what was quite unique for Indonesia, even compared to other Southeast Asian developing countries, in terms of housing provision, very small contribution of the state or even the private sector in the provision of housing. And most of the housing was developed by the people. And in many ways, it's rather informal and incremental processes. And one of the resulting problems because of this is there were illegal occupation, low access of poor people to urban amenities and infrastructure, and of course, land use conflicts. Okay, I skip this one before there will be two case studies. In emerging cities is rather mid-sized cities experiencing high urban growth and expansion, while at the same time having threatened by global change like coastal areas. So this is kind of extreme case studies that I will present it. I will not go too far from this because this morning has been explained. What was the complication is that Indonesia in practice trying to adopt a kind of duality of property rights, and that's one of the complication of the situation. And what was in relation to housing is like the basic agrarian law, 1960s. There is a debate whether to change it or keep it or retain it or make some adjustment, and it's considered quite ideological in many ways. And it's some arguments that the current law hinders the land market to function effectively. The other arguments is that it's too soft to deal with the commodification of the land. But on top of that, I would argue that actually the most important thing of the failure of this system is also happening in other policy system is the implementation. Sanction is already there, but how are sanction being implemented? That's another things. So what is happening is we have land speculation quite prominent, and at the same time the housing price, land price can be growing very rapidly in big cities especially. Sometimes it's not rational that every year land price continue to rising while there is no real demand. Especially for middle and upper class houses. And so much abandoned land. While many people has many houses, but the rest of the people even don't have access to good houses. And when we're talking about housing system, it also has to relate with the spatial and land use planning system. And the new law has been put in place, which more better sanction-oriented and more regulated land use systems. But it seems in at least empirically until now, it hasn't effectively come into a transformative way in the practice, because the implementation is again, in many cases, it's inconsistent. And the other problem is fragmentation of sectoral policy, as the previous sessions show about how the land administration and forest system, they fight with each other. And also when we come to the housing system, also we have a special planning system. And it's good now that Jokowi attempted to integrate these two systems, and politically it's very difficult to integrate these two, historically have their own system. And at the same time, the local government has an inadequate capacity to we have permit systems, and since decentralization, it's becoming more regulated. But one thing for sure is, even with the new system, that the process of development, land development process is very costly in Indonesia as compared to neighboring countries in terms of financial costs, social costs, and even time required to develop and administer land. So in Semarang, we see some that actually both in Semarang and in Manado, there are growing cities, extending cities, and they have common problems in relation to global threats like climate change. More and more land are not good for housing development, and at the same time the city center is very much gentrified at the one hand, and on the other hand it's poorly planned, and the rest of the poor people are forced to move out the cities. Also happening in Manado, because in the city center the land price is not rational for poor people. While if you look at many theories, actually there should be the low income people who could stay in the city and not the other way around. But it's not the case. For example, if we assess actually the inner city has better administered in terms of land. Most land has been registered with clear tenure, who's the owners. But this situation didn't really help the poor to have a better access to land, because still many low-income people still resides in the bad slums area, riversides, or even squatting, informally rent to others. And the other groups of low-income people pushed away from the city and they live in the suburbs, but in most cases, they have poor accessibility and lack of infrastructure. Sorry, I don't know how much, I still have time, right? Okay. Just to give an illustration, how one of the crucial steps, if we talk about housing development is in Indonesian context, is land registration. This is the critical issue, because this is the first bottleneck for every parties to really engage in housing development process. This is just to get an illustration how various steps that are required, and there is included kind of uncertainty in terms of time required, cost involved. This is only more space that are not certain. I'm looking at the detailed regulation is not there. We come up with the official, of course, for example, BPN is very restricted agency, and if you're looking at this, more uncertainty in it, and this is not to mention the informal processes involved during the registration, which is beyond the spheres of my research, because, for example, if we see these kind of steps, how especially for formal housing developers. Even before you register the land, when you are aiming to get the permit, that's already the first battle that you have to face. And for some reason, some researchers say even this initial phases could be much more costly than the land registration itself, because you have to deal with various strategic or political components of the cities, or even if you are large-scale development, then also you're engaged with the central political systems. This is all similar. This is what's happening in Manado, and this is not to mention that there are actually more actors involved informally. Third parties, local leaders, virtually could act as, for example, brokers invisibly, and you have to pay. And there is no clear regulations or rationale behind that. And even after that, even you already get access to land, you can build your own house. Another problem is infrastructure, as also Jamie mentioned. Even in a micro-scale infrastructure, it's problematic. This is just an illustration how the state seems to move away from the obligation in providing infrastructure, because every developers who have their own projects, they are required to prepare the facilities and infrastructure. And this is not easy for developers, because in practice, the local governments couldn't really facilitate this to be happen. And there are already kind of steps that developers have to follow. And recently, after decentralization, because it is more complex to acquire large land and to deal with multi-scale actors, there are trends that developers tend to divide the project into smaller ones, so it's more easier to manage. Even the permits is more simpler. You don't have to build infrastructure. So even a rich developer, they build a small cluster, and then after the project finished, the other cluster. But in the end, it's a bigger project. After a few years, the government realized this is a big project, and actually you have to for this kind of big project, you need to build this kind of infrastructure. You need to have environmental assessment, but that's too late. So developer is smarter in this case to handle the regulation. This is what we saw, what we feel in just few case studies, how actually a centralized uniform system has created a bottleneck in land administration. And in many cases, the officials tend to overlook relevant laws and regulation because there are informal processes engaged. From the transaction cost viewpoint, it's even higher than the formal one. And as the result, because of these costs, then there is no significant impact on improving low-income people access to their land. So this complication leading to delays, for example, for developers, or some or many developers try to silently violating regulation so they can complete it in time or for their own sakes, benefits or profits. So this is the end of my presentation. I will leave the recommendation for discussion, I think. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pat Dalit. Next, we have Patrick Guinness. Patrick teaches anthropology and convenes the Undergraduate Development Studies program at the ANU. He's taught at 3 Indonesian universities, University of Indonesia, Gadjah Mada University, and Airlangga University. His update paper is based on ongoing research conducted in Yogyakarta since 1975. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for staying around until almost 5 o'clock. It's been a long day. I hope I can keep this short or keep it to time and also entertain you with a few photos. My talk actually fits in very well with what Delik has just been talking about, because he mentioned the urban poor and mentioned problems to do with illegal occupation and housing standards. And I want to continue on that theme and look at urban squatter areas and urban low-income housing areas. Delik also mentioned, at least it was written up on the board, that 85% of urban housing was self-help housing, or which was built with informal and incremental processes. So they're the sort of things I want to talk about today, and I particularly want to put this problem before you of what do we do with places like this? And I want to ask the question in terms of government and people, because my focus here is on people's sovereignty. So I want to ask, where is the room, where is the space for people's sovereignty in illegal occupation areas, illegal housing areas like this? That, by the way, that last photo was Ciliwung River in Jakarta. I'll be referring mostly to Jogja, but I want to get on to some of the work that Pak Jokowi did in Solo and Jakarta as I come further in the talk. This is an area I work in Jogja, and like a few speakers earlier, it's a bit of a longitudinal study. So I do apologize if I'm referring backwards and forwards, but I've been working here for 40 years. Not living there for 40 years, but I've lived there over probably a period of 5 or 6 years, not just as a researcher, but as a tenant. So I first got there as more or less a boarder, and then later on became a researcher there. As you can see, this is a riverside area. So one of my key concerns is these riverside kampungs. One of my earliest informants, friends, helpers was Pak Ran. He was a sand digger. And that meant that the river was his resource. He collected sand there and sold it for the construction sites of the city. What I'm referring to here, of course, is the informal sector. These are people who are not regulated by government, and they are completely dependent on their own skills to find a niche within the urban market. Pak Ran, 40 years later, is still a sand digger. He's now blind. His wife died several years ago, but he continues to find his way with his stick to the river and to dig out sand. His neighbours suggest that he's blind because of his drinking habits. But I don't know. I don't know the medical side of this. But he still continues, and so do a number of his friends. Now, this is not to say that conditions have not changed in this area. It's to say, rather, that this continues to be an economic niche for people to occupy, to find sand for their neighbours or others. When I first arrived in this place, people were building their homes with bamboo. And they were occupying what I call a river flat area, where they could also plant their banana palms, their fruit trees, keep goats and ducks and chickens, and construct almost a village life. And in fact, that was one of the reasons I was attracted to this place. It felt like a village. I come from another village environment before then. But you can see behind these bamboo houses are also the houses of people who are perhaps more settled there and have got brick homes. In fact, in this large area, only about 12, maybe 15 people held titles, and they dated back to the 1920s. And the rest of the people were squatting on the land. So no titles, no certificates have been issued since Dutch times. As the period went on, this whole river flat area became more congested. And these were people who were finding space for themselves in this area. Now my topic, what I want to look at here is, how does government deal with this? How do we regulate this? Or maybe we don't regulate it. This is the challenge for government, because this is a completely unregulated, what is sometimes said to be illegible to government. It's hidden spaces. It's marginal. And as I said, the economic issues are marginal. The land occupation is marginal to the city. There is also a rich diversity of people living in these areas. I do want to emphasize this, because we often stereotype the urban poor or the squatters as being of one type, doing the same sort of thing, being the same unruly floating mass. In fact, there's huge diversity. There are public servants living here. There are shop assistants and office workers, but a vast majority of people are working in that informal sector. Also, you could see the other ways in which they're diverse. There are landowners and there are pengindung, people who occupy the land of others. There's the pegawai, the wong cilik, the little people. There's the house owners, and then those who contract or rent from them. And there's that diversity of building materials. But there's something which brings that diversity of people together. In Jogja, we talk about rukun, and I'm sure in other cities there are other terms for that. It's a solidarity sometimes created by government, sometimes by officials, but often something which is very firmly held to by people there. There's also a diversity of squatter settlements themselves, and I cannot possibly generalize about them. The riverside squatter settlements will be different from others. So I just want to draw that to your attention. One of the issues I want to raise with you is the idea that these are not marginal people who are just waiting to be accepted or waiting to be brought in to the government swathes, if you like. But these are people who are part already of the forces which create a city. And they have been marginalised within those city dynamics. So Abidin Kusno, an Indonesian who grew up in Jakarta but now works in Vancouver in the Institute of Asian Studies, he talks about the three forces of the city. There's the creative destruction of capitalist growth, of economic growth, which is found in the way that land is bought up, and many of the speakers today have been talking about that. Capitalist growth moving into various areas as soon as land becomes available. There's the state, who tends to characterize kampung people as being a floating mass, as being poor, or a variety of other words which are used. I think I've got a slide on this. I'll come back to it. Referring to kampung as being padat, kumuh, and miskin. Pakumis. So padat, congested, kumuh, ugly, and miskin, poor. That's who they are. So these people are excluded, stereotyped out of existence, or as some sort of unruly mass. And of course, there are criminals. There are prostitutes amongst my neighbours. And many of my neighbours find that when they go to school and people know where they come from, they say, oh, you're from that area. Move to the back of the class. So they do face some kind of stereotyping and discrimination. And then Pak Kusno would say there's the third force. And this he calls the vernacular environment. This is the kampung people or the poor people who are themselves a force in the city. And over the years, we've had many scholars who have said those in the informal sector make an important contribution to the economy and to the social life of the city. They are not there eventually to be accepted. They are already a dynamic part of that. So let's go on and talk about the kind of structures which the state has been using to include the people in these settlements. This is the first effort, and this was back in the 1970s or 80s. This is a rubbish dump. It was directly opposite where I was living. And the municipal government decided, well, if they couldn't move the people, then they dumped the rubbish there. And so eventually, hopefully, people would move of their own accord. It led, at a time of the rainy season, to this whole mass of rubbish collapsing into the river and, in fact, causing a huge flood in the opposite area. And after that, the government decided on a different tactic. Very briefly, because I can see I'm already running out of time. How much do I have? I've got 10, lovely. 8. All right, good. Very briefly, I'd like to talk about the way that the Wongchilik, the little people, cope with this situation. So I said it's dynamic, and I said there's a power and there's a force in the Wongchilik themselves, which I think we need to recognise. So I've given you a whole long list of things here. I call these the informalisation processes, because what I want to do is to say this is not just a formal sector and an informal sector. There's actually a dynamic going on here where small people are informalising a whole range of processes within the city. They are creating space themselves, not only in terms of housing or land occupation or employment, which I've spoken about, but social services and governance and infrastructure. And Pat Delik earlier mentioned, the low amenities within poor areas. Well, I'd like to add that poor people actually have created their own amenities. And I'll show you some pictures of those in a moment. They run their own credit associations. Of course, you're all familiar with Arisan and Simpan Pinjam. All right, this is part of how people manage to survive and manage to get credit. They run health clinics, almost entirely with their own personnel who've been trained as kader. Occasionally, they'll persuade a doctor to come in and provide services free. But they run health clinics for the elderly and health clinics for the under fives. And then there's the governance structures. Of course, the Airway RT officials are not paid officials. The lowest level of paid official in the urban government system is at the Kelurahan level. And some people confuse the kelurahan with being the grassroots level of urban living. In fact, there's 2 levels below that, where all the dynamism of people in these areas is found. And these RWRT organizations are extremely important institutions. And then there's the infrastructure. They have constructed, and I'll show you some slides, pathways, washing places, toilets, and even mosques to further cement and consolidate their standing. Some people would call orang kecil or wong cilik as having a separate culture. 5 minutes. I would go along with that in one sense, but not want to make the point that it's a kampungan kind of culture that is a decrepit sort of close your eyes kind of situation where we better not know what's going on. This is rather a culture which does have specific characteristics different from the wider population, but it's very positive in many ways. Let's have a quick look at these slides. What I'm interested here is in looking at these strategies of informalisation. Let me just pick on one, because it comes into my later comparison. The Wong Cilik create land. They don't just occupy land, they make land. As you can see here, they actually push the river a bit further over so that they can build where the river used to flow. And with rocks and earth and sandbags and a whole range of things, they create, and this guy's a sand digger too, by the way, so he's constructed his land, and so have others along the way there. Now, formalising. Let's get to the other side of the equation. What does the government do about this? How do they make this place legible? How do they control it and regulate? Or maybe they shouldn't. Because they're faced with this general critique that these are areas of spiralling deterioration. These are 2 urban planners talking here. So the need is to get rid of these areas because they're a blight on the city. So one way the government has often talked is to say, we'll partner these Wong Cilik. And of course, this does happen at election time. This is a Golkar rally, by the way, but the banner was in the right place. So I showed 2 parties in one. But both parties are, at the time of elections, trying to bring people into the stable, partly with gifts of 50,000 or 100,000 to buy their votes. Let me go on to Pak Jokowi for a moment. And I want to look at 2 experiments which Pak Jokowi did in Solo. The Banjarsari Park in Solo was where I think Pak Jokowi really made his reputation in terms of dealing with and getting down on the same level as the poor and consulting with them, talking with them, and generally, in that way, bringing them along with him. And he persuaded 989 vendors who worked in Banjarsari Park to relocate to a traditional market by promising them 2 things. The park would not be taken over by capitalist interests. It was going to remain as a recreational area. And second, that the traditional market where they were going to would be protected from shopping malls. That is, there would be a ring of 500 metres around the traditional market where no shopping malls would be allowed. So he, in a sense, was siding with the siding with the small people against capitalist interests. He also persuaded a whole lot of riverside settlers to also move. And, it was seen as very successful. In fact, I haven't made research in solar, but the accounts I've read suggest that later attempts by Pat Jokowi were far less successful. He became a little bit impatient, or his bureaucrats did. There was less consultation, and there was more dissatisfaction for both vendors and squatters who were forced to move. So the initial impetus was strong, later was not so good. Here's Banjarsari Park, cleared vendors. And here's another Jokowi experiment, Kampung Deret in Jakarta, replacing or offering squatters the chance to live in these grey and orange rectangular boxes. The critics of this suggest that, it's not just a matter of giving people new houses. There's a whole way of life built around community life, which is also important to people. And to just regard a house as a block of concrete at a clean, time's up, clean block of is not enough. All right, I am going to I'm going to finish. All right, I'm going to finish with this, because I think this is the option I want to leave you with, is rather than trying to persuade the poor to accept the accommodations of a traditional market or a new house, is actually to empower the poor in their own spaces and to use the skills which they have in their own spaces, the community skills, the particular individual building skills, etc. And to use those spaces to consolidate their own way of life. I'm showing you a variety of photos here of the area where I live, but I want to come to this one, or to this actually. The PNPM program, which we haven't heard much about today and which is officially over, I believe. But the PNPM program in the kampung worked extremely well. It worked through local committees, completely independent of kampung leaders, and it worked through financial accounting measures, completely transparent to the local population, and it constructed facilities like wells and water towers for distribution. Here's their local plaque, one of them. This particular one I was looking at had 14 projects in a period of 3 years, put together all sorts of things. And the final slide, which also to me is evidence of something which works when the state does not dictate where people should go, but actually allows local skills to be built up. Part of the PNPM program is microcredit for women. I just want to show you evidence of a particular microcredit scheme. Here is a woman using her money to bake a whole variety of different biscuits, which she then sells, particularly for Lebaran. Another women's scheme which was supported by this was a recycling scheme, which has also been very successful in Surabaya, where people recycle, divide out all the different metal, paper, tins, glassware, etc., and sell that to recyclers. So 2 projects where people's own organisational skills, own cooking skills, and particularly women's skills have been encouraged through this. So I'll finish there with that sort of empowerment kind of thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, for that very interesting and engaging session. So we have a little bit of time left for questions. So Ross, and over here. Do you have one more? At the back there. So Ross, do you want to?
Thank you, Ali. Ross McLeod from the Indonesia project. My comment is mainly addressed to Jamie. I thoroughly share your pessimism about the possibility of Jokowi managing to build all of the infrastructure that he's been talking about building, and indeed, at least partly for the reason that you adduced, namely the difficulty of resuming land for public purposes. I'd like to make this following suggestion, because this is certainly a problem. The resumption of land actually has two aspects of it. One is taking over the land and shifting it to different party. The other is fixing and paying the compensation for that. It seems to me the main reason why there is such a lot of delay in building infrastructure these days is that phase of determining the size of compensation has to be gone through before the land is taken over. But I can't see any reason why that should be so. It seems to me the government clearly has the authority under the Constitution to resume land. Once it identifies that land, it could take it over today, and the amount of compensation could be determined sometime in the future, so that the project could go ahead and be built without any delay at all. And rather than having the compensation determined by BPN, if that's the institution that does it now, everybody seems to think, and who am I to doubt, that it's a very corrupt institution. Why don't we set up a new land valuation agency or commission like the Anti-Corruption Commission outside of the regular civil service, and recruit a whole lot of very highly professional land valuers to work in that institution at arm's length from the government. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. We had another question here.
Thank you. I'm Terry Hull from ANU. I have a question related to the barriers to the registration and transfer of land. One of the, you've got a web of paper that you've described. I think both Jamie and Delik described this web of paperwork and all the offices you have to go to. But I think there's another set of barriers, and those are the identification papers that people have to show. They're KTP, they're oftentimes when you're dealing with inheritance, you have to show all kinds of papers of marriage and the legal status of the individuals. And this is particularly a barrier for poorer people. The United Nations recently has called for a data revolution, and one of the arguments that they have is that there are a huge number of people who are invisible in the society. Patrick has described his kampong. Most of the people in his kampong probably are documented through the KTP and other documentation. But there were probably up to 9 million people at the last census who were missed. And this seems to me to be a barrier. It's not just the land and the soil, it's also the people. And making the whole thing work doesn't mean that you have a single roof under which you do the land transfer, but you have to have a single roof that includes all these other issues as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we have one more question.
Yes, my name is Wahyu Diatmika. I'm from Tempo Magazine. I have a question for Jamie Davidson. In your remark, you said that Jokowi hasn't made any breakthrough in land appropriation. I just want to draw your attention to two recent cases where Jokowi inaugurated the power plant project in Batang, Central Java, and another one when Ahok, the governor of Jakarta, resolved the case for land acquisition in Fatmawati, Jakarta, for the MRT project. In your opinion, what really happened there? Is this a sign of change in land appropriation in the future, or this is just individual cases that will not represent any breakthrough? Thank you.
All right, Can you hear me? No. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, more kind of comments than real questions. I mean, I don't know why they haven't happened. I mean, the first process you describe is when the government takes the land, and then later compensation is basically determined and played out. That's basically exactly what happens in Malaysia, and the government did point to that fact. But there were a lot of other forces at work that stopped that. I mean, the law says that it's, according to the law, they have 500 and, I forget the exact number, 536 days or something, and I guess people are just going to play it out that that's fast enough for this project, and it's certainly a lot slower than a process that you were describing. You know, why not take it out of the hands of BPN? I don't know why. Yeah, they could have, they should have. The time to do it was when the law was passed. I said that the law doesn't state BPN specifically. It says, you know, I think it says pemerintah or something like that. And it was ambiguous enough to, in the future, to do exactly what you suggested. But it wasn't done. And my kind of, you know, my argument is that Jokowi at this time, because he's so focused on getting these projects done, is not, maybe he's convinced that taking a step back and setting up a better institutional structure to get this done faster in the future, he hasn't taken that approach. So I really don't know. I don't have any good answers to say why this wasn't done. But I mean, yeah, those are clear policy recommendations that just weren't taken. No, those are two cases. You know, I have a handful of cases as well, but in terms of, is there really anything new, any breakthrough? Jokowi, when he was governor, he had a few cases that he was able to, regarding some of the, I think the ring road, and he was able to solve, but you know, after a very long time. I guess we'll just have to see. You know, one case here, one case there doesn't amount to any real breakthroughs. You have to have a lot more systematic data to show. Maybe I'm being premature, but it doesn't seem like there's a large breakthrough, but maybe a case here or there. Maybe there's reasons for, I mean, if you're a fan of building fast infrastructure, reason for optimism.
Thank you for the second comments about data verification. Yeah, I think in many ways the availability of data contributes to the extent of informality that is taking place in many procedure, land procedure and civil related procedure. And in my observation, actually, informality is, in Indonesian cultural context, it doesn't have to mean inferiority, because even the largest developers could enjoy from this informality in many respects, I would say. So when you talk about data, I have also my own experience that because of no available data when I was building my house, for example, it is kind of commodity. This kind of unavailability of data for kind of a transaction that has to go through the offices. So the main problem is not about how to. You can make any good database systems, but that's the hard part of the infrastructure. But what is also important is to build a strong soft infrastructure. The capacity of the officials, even you give them a very highly technological system, there has to be a good capacity of the officials in soft infrastructure, and also bureaucratic reform to really make the human resources and the institutional resources to be more responsive and effective. So I think, yeah, that's to add the situation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I will make a quick announcement before thanking the speakers. Unless there are any really pressing questions, I think we should wrap it up now because we're over time. Just to say, for those who have registered and paid for tonight's dinner at Delik 6, there will be a volunteer waiting at the foyer of University House at 6:15 to escort you to the venue. If you're familiar with Delik 6, you're more than welcome to make your own way there by 6:30. But that's just for those who have already registered and paid for the dinner. And will you join me now in thanking our speakers?